Welcome to PARSHA for parents and grandparents. This week we're looking at Parshat Mishpatim, and unfortunately it's not a live recording, but studio recorded. But we'll try to be brief and to the point. Our Parsha this week, Mishpatim, means the laws. The word mishpat means justice when it's an abstract noun. It also refers to a sentence, both in the same sense that we use in English, a sentence is a unit of language, but also a sentence being the decision of a court. So mishpatim are usually brief laws that are given in sentences, but they also are norms that are being established. Sometimes this is called sentence literature because there isn't always an obvious through line, a narrative, for example, that takes you from one law to the next. In fact, we have many, many laws, as we'll see momentarily. The parsha begins with the letter Vav, Ve'ela, and these are the laws that you shall place before them. Remember that just last week in Yitro, we were reading the Decalogue on Mount Sinai. Even the word, though the letter Vav and these is not necessarily significant in the Bible, the rabbis, not looking at the pshat, the plain meaning of the text, but the drush, sort of the additional meaning that he gets, said there was some significance to the vav, this vav consecutive, this, meaning and. They said that just like the laws beforehand, the ones that we read in Yitro were given on Mount Sinai, so too all these commandments were given on Mount Sinai. And this we will come to at the very end of the parasha, when Moses goes back up to the mountain and receives Torah for 40 days and 40 nights. There's a sense that not only that which is listed, but even that which is anticipated in the future, even a question to be asked by a Jewish school child at Golda Academy was somehow given at Mount Sinai. So it's a beautiful aspect of this week's Parsha, but it does have a lot of information. So we're going to dive right into it now. The screen share here. It's my opening slide. And now let's see the outline. We have basically 4 chapters, 21, 2, 3, and 4, and each of them is chock full of mitzvahs. So the first one begins with the laws about the Eved Ivri, a Jewish or an Israelite slave, and speaks about a man. And it's got this rule that his term of service is really 6 years, after which there's the 7th year of manumission, of being freed. So in this sense, he's not really a chattel slave, the way we think of it in America, but more like an indentured servant, which they also had in America during the colonial period. When people came over from Europe, usually from England, as indentured servants, they would serve their master for a few years, and then the expectation was that they too would become a freedman. Here it describes that, well, what if the person doesn't want to go free? For example, if during this term of servitude, he was given by his master a wife, they had children, and he doesn't want to leave them, which is quite understandable. Then in a way, he has to vow and make himself a slave for life by having his ear attached to the door, sort of a symbolic way of saying that he's no longer going to be free, but he's going to be attached to the household. It's disturbing, true, but it is a little bit volitional. And the Hebrew servant, just like the Hebrew female servant, also has certain rights, as we see right after this. Now, I hate to add, but I will, that this refers to a fellow Israelite. There's also in the Bible, in rabbinic literature too, something called the Eved Kanani, the Canaanite slave, or the Shifra Kanani, the slave, female slave, who's a Canaanite, which really just means not Jewish. And there are a lot of the protections which we read about here are absent, and they do indeed become some sort of a chattel slave who are inherited. It's a long and big topic, and there are a lot of them in this parsha. What does Judaism say about slavery? Is it offended by slavery in principle, or is it only when we were slaves in Egypt that it was a problem, or is it only the excessive hardship that we were worked before, with cruelty in Egypt, that was the issue? Well, the Bible doesn't really give us an abstract answer. Several times, though, in the Parsha, it tells us to be sensitive to the needs of the stranger in our midst, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And from that, we Jews have tended to read these texts as saying that just as you were slaves and suffered you should not cause others to suffer. And so you could say that slavery, which was very commonplace in antiquity, is being somehow limited in the Bible, even if not entirely eliminated. Now, this chapter 21 has many other rules. It's got rules of manslaughter, that is accidental killing, in which case the killer is supposed to run for his life and go to a city of refuge where he can take sanctuary. A lot of important ideas, like the idea of sanctuary for people who are fleeing and seeking asylum, are found here. And the idea is that that a person who killed another person might themselves, through their negligence, be worthy of being killed, but because it wasn't intentional, they're not truly a murderer. And so the Torah is trying to differentiate two actions which on the surface look identical. They both have one person killing the other. But if there is criminal intent, if there's murderous intent, then even if the person has sought asylum, they can be ripped from the altar and tried and sentenced to death. So the Torah doesn't have an opposition in principle to the death penalty. And in fact, it becomes a major topic in rabbinic literature about whether we are in favor of the death penalty or opposed to the death penalty. On one hand, the rabbis go into great details about the 4 methods of execution that they derive from the Torah. And you wouldn't tell from looking at both the book Sanhedrin or Tractate Makot that the rabbis had something against execution in principle. However, they did list a lot of concerns with fairness and with evidence. And in the Jewish system, you needed to have 2 valid witnesses, not only to the criminal act, but also to a prior statement of criminal intention. And since that's very hard to get, the rabbis believed that it would seldom yield an execution. In fact, some rabbis claim, had they been alive when the Sanhedrin was in business, they never would have seen anybody executed. It's a big topic. My friend and colleague, my rabbi, actually, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, wrote a tshuva on the subject of the participation in the death penalty. Should Jews serve on a jury that in a capital case? Should they serve as prosecutors or as judges in such cases, or give testimony if they have concerns about the fairness of capital punishment in our time, in our society? We also have laws here of battery, that is of assaulting somebody, and the many different forms of compensation that are owed. The rabbis believe you had to compensate the person not only for their medical bills, but also for their lost compensation when they weren't able to work, also for their suffering, some sort of a pain type of compensation, and also their bullshit, the humiliation of having been beaten by another person in public. So all those different aspects of battery are required in Jewish law, and they're not always observed here in our own society. We also have laws against stealing a person, you could say like hostage taking, which is unfortunately something we've experienced even recently in the Jewish community. We also have a description here. It's not direct, it's indirect, but it says that that if you have a slave, a woman who's a slave, who you marry off to your son, that you can't deny her the rights of an Israelite wife for she'era, ksut, and onah, which basically means her food, her shelter, and her and marital relations, sex. You might say, well, do you really have to have a man promise to have sex with a woman? Well, remember, this is with his wife. We're talking about a time of polygamy, and a man might be married to multiple women. He might have favorites among them, and maybe the women will compete with one another, as we see the story of even the sisters, Rachel and Leah, with Jacob. And so the man is promising that he will be sexually available to his wife, because, of course, if she's married but doesn't produce a child, then she also doesn't have anyone to care for her in her old age. And so a lot of her status, her normal human desire to be a mother would be in his control. And so he's promising to be her partner and to protect her in that way. Now, as we'll come back to the laws of abortion in just a moment, But the rabbis also are interested in the lex talionis, which is a Latin phrase for ayin tachet ayin, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, leg for a leg. The premise being that if I assault another person and put out their eye, the Torah seems to say that in response, I should get what I gave. So I should have the same consequence. My eye should be taken out. If I cut off someone's hand, my hand should be cut off. That is the pshat meaning of ayin tachet ayin. But the rabbis didn't accept that was possible. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. I think that's the expression. And they say that no, it means mammon. It means compensation for that damage, that physical damage with money. Well, then how would you decide what is a eye worth? And they said, well, because they lived in a time of slavery, well, what would be the selling price for a man, let's say, with two eyes versus a man with only one eye? And so that differential would be what you would pay as compensation, in addition to the other compensations of for their suffering, their medical care, their lost compensation, and their shame. Okay, so those are the main things in chapter 21. Chapter 21 also ends with a description of damage caused by our property. Let's say I have an ox that gores others. Now maybe the ox has never done it before. It's a big surprise. Imagine you have a dog, and like most dog owners say, oh, he's friendly. But this time, no, this time he bit your neighbor. So you were surprised. And so according to the rabbis, that would cause like a half liability. But if the ox had gored before, if your dog had bit before, then you can't really pretend to be surprised, and you're more responsible. It's also true not only for our live property, but also for our property, like if we have a pit on our land, or we have a swimming pool for that matter that's not gated, we are liable for damage done to others. And this, by the way, this section, which is the foundation of a part of Jewish law called nizikin, or torts, was also the foundation of a tshuva that I wrote a few years back on artificial intelligence. Are we responsible for the damage done by machines that we own but don't entirely control, just like animals that we own but don't entirely control? So that's chapter 21. Chapter 22, you've got a description of the thief, the midnight thief who breaks into the house, and the house owner is expected to defend themselves. And if they do it by killing their intruder, they're considered to be free from any liability. When the person broke into a house at night, they should have assumed someone was going to be asleep there and would try to defend themselves, and therefore they give up their rights to their own life. But the Torah says if the person broke in during the daytime, maybe they thought no one would be around or they could get away or something like that, then the householder can defend themselves, but they have to defend themselves with minimal lethality. And so if they could have just struck the person in the leg, but instead stabbed them in the chest, they may be, in fact, liable for killing that person when they didn't have to. And this is quite different, again, from American law, unfortunately, where sort of stand your ground. If you have a gun, you can kill somebody and don't have to say, well, it was the minimum force that I used. Okay, so that's thieves and self-defense. What happens if I light a fire on my property? I'm burning some brush, and the fire goes out of control, and it goes over to my neighbor's yard and burns their crops. Maybe they've already done the harvest, and they've got all their grain ready to be taken inside, and it burns it. So my negligence is going to cause me to be responsible. But what happens if it seemed like safe what I was doing, but then an unusual wind came and whipped the little fire I had started, made it a giant fire and destroyed my neighbor's property? The rabbis then have a sense that you have diminished liability because it was not a predictable destruction. And so these verses in the Bible lead the rabbis to a really nuanced idea about our damages and how much liability we should have based on what we can expect to happen. Here's a description of seduction. What if a man seduces a woman and he's punished for doing that? I hate to say it, but this is not a feminist text. This is saying that he, in essence, sort of stole property from the young woman's father, who could have sold his daughter off into marriage, married her off for a lot more money, and now less money. Very disturbing on a gender equality analysis. But we also have here responsibility for seducing and blaming the man and not only the woman, which, to be honest, is also somewhat of an improvement over some societies, including our own. There's prohibition on witchcraft, bestiality, idolatry. There's a description of our obligations to protect the stranger, the widow, the orphan. There's a very sensitive passage about if someone poor borrows money from you and you take as a guarantee some of their property, you have to be careful with their property and you have to be sensitive to their dignity. We're also told not to curse judges or the prince. We're supposed to give our firstborn to serve God somehow. That maybe that was the first plan for priesthood, and also our first animals to God. And then on the other hand, we should be holy people, throwing torn meat, that is treif meat, to dogs, and not eating it ourselves. The Torah Parsha goes on in chapter 23 by telling us not to gossip or false witness. It tells us not to follow the mob. We'll come back to that in a minute. Not to show favoritism in court, which means that even the poor have to be treated equally. You might think that they're only worried that you might choose to favor the rich, but here they're also worried that a judge might skew the justice in favor of the poor. Let's say a rich person and a poor person are in dispute over $100, and the judge thinks this rich person doesn't need $100, the poor person really does. What would be the big harm if I sort of bent the law to favor the poor? But the problem would be it would undermine confidence in justice, and so therefore it can't be done. We also have description of the sabbatical year and some sort of an extra protection. The rabbis were very interested in this, even though they probably didn't fully practice it in their time, about how you added before and after the sabbatical year time that you wouldn't do your own farming. We have a description of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, and it says 3 times a year you shall appear before the Lord, before the face of your Lord. It's possible that the original Hebrew is Yir'eh et Pnei Hashem Elokecha, you will see the face of the Lord your God. But then later on, the Masoretes, the people who added the vowels to the Torah, didn't like this implication that you would actually see God's face, and so they changed it into a strange passive form, Yir'eh et Pnei, you will be seen with the face of the Lord, and so they tried to change it in that way. Finally, we finish this Parsha in chapter 24. I'm going very quickly. You see there's more there, with a narrative. After all these laws, chapter 24 says that Moses and Aaron's sons, the 70 elders, all go up towards the mountain. Moses reads the Decalogue, presumably back to the people. He asks them whether they'll keep it. They say yes, everything in it, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we will listen. Not clear what they mean, but it seems to be saying that they pledged allegiance before they even had full comprehension, which is a very nice thing to do. And the rabbis, the Midrash, believe that when they said na'aseh v'nishma, they were each given 2 jewels to wear as a reward, but when they sinned the golden calf, they had to give away those jewels. In any event, the people say this thing, Moses splashes blood of covenant on them, literally a blood bath. And then there's the second theophany, and the elders go up and they see God on a throne, and under his feet is a sapphire pavement, a very strange and mysterious teaching, which is a favorite of later texts. When we speak about seeing the tzitzit, the blue thread, which we'll read about later in the book of Numbers, the rabbis say, Uritem oto, you will see it. They think perhaps means you will see God, because the blue reminds you of the blue of the sea, which is like the blue of the sky, which is like the blue of the divine throne. And so in a way, by seeing the Tchelet, you are also seeing God, even though we don't believe that God can be physically seen. We also have a description of the giving of the tablets, the Horatam, in order to use them to instruct the people. And then we're told that Joshua is going to guard the entrance to the mountain while Moses goes up in the clouds, while Aaron and Hur will go back to the camp and lead the people. Finally, the Parsha ends with a description about how Moses stays up in the cloud for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, we're going to continue now with our focus. So the first detailed look has to do with abortion. We've got a description about two men who are fighting, and somewhat clumsily, they run into one of their wives, and she's pregnant. And in the collision, perhaps unintentionally, one man causes her to abort her pregnancy and lose the child. Right? So it's an unpleasant scene, a violent scene, a tragic scene, but it says in the Torah, "V'lo yeh ason." What happens if the fetus comes out, she miscarries, but there isn't ason? The word ason means like a damage, and the rabbis believe that this means that a loss of life. So what does this mean then? They hit this woman, and she loses the pregnancy, but not life. Okay? Then it says, in that case, you have to pay the damage for the lost pregnancy. But then in verse 23, it says, "Ve'im ason yeh," but if there is a loss of life, then you have to give life for life. This is understood in Jewish tradition to mean that, that the status of the fetus is different from the status of a full person, that the fetus is sort of like the property, part of the mother's body, perhaps part of the property of the family, but not its own life. The rabbis in Tractate Sanhedrin will claim that until the fetus comes out and breathes the air of the world, it is considered secondary to the life of the mother. And this little text from our Parsha is an indication that's been used to prove that Judaism does not oppose abortion across the board, but considers the status of the fetus to be lesser than the status of the mother, and therefore from maternal need to save the life or even the health of the mother, an abortion could be permitted. I'm going to pause and I'll continue just a moment. Okay, so now let's look at a second text that's important in terms of its later history, which is a pasuk in chapter 23, a verse in 23. It says like this: "Lo tieh achrei rabim l'ra'ot." Don't follow the many, the rabim, the many, to do wrong. "Lo ta'aneh ariv lintot achrei rabim lahatot." Very strange words which are hard to translate. This is an old JPS translation. "You should not give perverse testimony in a dispute, so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty." So this seems to be about like what you could call mob rule, where you are trying to ingratiate yourselves with the powers that be, with the majority, and you're being told to live with integrity, not to follow the minority, not to follow the majority and abuse the minority, and to go against justice. And we can all understand the motivation of a public official, especially a judge. You know, maybe they're campaigning on a tough on crime type of platform so they can get reelected, and it might be tempting to go extra harsh on somebody beyond what's required or deserved in order to sort of win over the majority. So this is sort of understood to be don't follow the mob. However, it does kind of also seem to say, don't follow the majority l'ra'ot, to do bad, don't follow the majority in a bad way, but that might imply do follow the majority in a good way. And so the rabbis say that, what do they mean by good and bad? Well, imagine it's a capital trial, and the judges are evenly divided between exonerating the person or convicting them. So in this case, the rabbis quite remarkably say to convict someone is a bad thing to do. To exonerate them is a good thing to do. And you might say, hold on a second, doesn't it matter whether the person's really guilty or really innocent? But the rabbis actually took a little bit more of a formalistic perspective. And they said, well, you need, if you have a slight majority to exonerate, let's say 13 and say that they're innocent and 12 would say that they're guilty, then that one person majority can suffice to exonerate them. But the opposite is not true. If you had 13 saying guilty and 12 saying innocent, that would not suffice. that would just be a majority doing bad, a majority convicting someone and therefore sentencing them to death. And so they say you can't have just a slim majority. You would have to have at least two people. So you'd have to have, let's say, a 14 to 11 verdict in order to find a person guilty. Our system, we go for unanimous conviction or exonerations, but here they were establishing the principle of majority rule. Now, a funny and remarkable way that it plays out is in one of the greatest stories in the Talmud, Tractate Bava Metzia 59b. It's what the rabbis call the Tanur Shel Achnai story. It talks about a special type of oven that was constructed of ceramic tiles that was sort of done in a spiral, which looked like a snake, and the Achnai was a kind of snake. And so the question was really, how do you purify this oven? And it was a big debate. Some said it's pure, some said it's not pure. And in the end, the two giants who sort of took this on were Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, who were the two primary students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who sort of led them out of the city of Jerusalem just before the Romans sacked it and created the yeshiva in Yavna, and they themselves became the teachers of Rabbi Akiva. So these are giants of the Talmud. And in this case, Rabbi Yoshua is the more popular one. He's got everybody on his side, but Rabbi Eliezer is not giving up. And Rabbi Eliezer sort of summons one miracle after another to prove his point. And he'll say, if I'm right, let the river run backwards. The river runs backwards. But Rabbi Yoshua says, we don't determine the law based on rivers running backwards. And he says, if I'm right, let this tree prove me right. And the tree uproots and flies. Again, we don't listen to trees that are flying. Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let the walls of this house prove it. And the walls start to buckle. Rabbi Yoshua says, you have no business, you walls. And so they stop, but they don't go straight back to where they were because the walls are afraid of both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. It's a charming story. But finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, look, I know I'm right. I can prove it. If I'm right, let a voice come from heaven, come and tell me. So I'll read in the Hebrew now. Why are you fighting with Rabbi Eliezer? The law is always like him. Rabbi Yeshua is really annoyed at this point, and he stands up and yells back at heaven. Amad Rabbi Yoshua Vaglav Amar Lo B'Shemayim. Rabbi Joshua gets up and says, look, the Torah is not in heaven anymore, right? Quoting from the end of the book of Deuteronomy, right? My Lo B'Shemayim. What does it mean that it's not in heaven? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Shekvar Nitna Torah Mehar Sinai Einanu Mashgichim B'Bat Kol Shekvar Ketafta B'Har Sinai B'Torah Afrei Rabim B'Hatot. So we don't listen to heavenly voices. Once the Torah has been given at Mount Sinai, it's now in our possession, and we follow our majority. And we don't listen to you, God. It's among the most radical things that are said in the Talmud. It seems to be saying that we humans have the responsibility and the authority to interpret the Torah according to our own understanding and not to rely on prophecy anymore. There's a great coda to the story, Ashkechei Rabbi Natan Eliyahu. So this Rabbi Natan once found Elijah and said, Amar ma avid kutshabrichu b'hahishata. Says, what did God respond when Rabbi Yeshua said this chutzpah thing that the Torah is not in heaven, we don't listen to the heavenly voices anymore? Amar le kachaychi v'amar itzchuni b'nai itzchuni b'nai. That is, God smiled and said, my children have beat me, my children have beat me. In other words, we've got this idea that majority rule is actually quite important. So you go from a biblical pshat saying that don't follow the mob, don't follow the majority, to a, at least within the rabbinic elite, a sense that we do follow the majority of the sages, and we do so much that we even do it against a divine voice. Right, so those are my two detailed looks. We're going to look now at table talk. I can find out how to move this against the slide. So things you might talk about with kids. The Torah warns judges not to show favoritism to the rich or to the poor. But why not? Why not favor those who can least afford to pay? Shouldn't we be a little bit more sympathetic to the people who are poorest. So what's the negative here? And I hope if you speak with kids about this, you'll try to show them that, well, yes, we do have to help the poor in other ways, but not in ways that undermine the justice of the system. And if there is injustice in the system, that there's structural injustice like we often have here, then we should be addressing that directly, structurally, and not just by sort of modifying specific rulings. Second point, the portion features dozens of mitzvot, blending social justice and theology. So why not keep those realms separate? We here in America, we don't like it if a judge quotes religion. We don't like it when Judge Moore in Alabama had the 10 Commandments in his courtroom. We want to keep things separate, but the Torah itself blends them. So is there a place for religious faith or even just morality in a discussion of secular law, or should it always just be following the rules and the rules only? In our parsha, sometimes it seems like people can see God. I'm thinking of both the pilgrimage part that I mentioned, and also at the end when it seems to be that the elders saw God. By the way, the rabbis think that two of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, they looked at God brazenly, and that's why they later were killed. Why weren't they killed on the spot? Well, it would have ruined a really important day. I don't think that's such a great explanation, because after all, the day that they were incinerated was the dedication of the tabernacle. So, but the rabbis say that no, it's not that they saw God. They saw the blue pavement under the altar, and that's what we get a sense of when we look at the tzitzit, the blue string, for those of us who wear techelet. And this could lead you to a discussion about the function of symbols in spiritual life. What's good about a symbol, like a mezuzah or something like that? Is there any danger that you might perhaps make it too much of a stand-in for God and think that you're worshiping the mezuzah instead of really worshiping God? So that's what I wanted to share. I'm sorry I couldn't do it in person. I hope that you all have a Shabbat Shalom and that you've learned something useful about Parshat Mishpatim. Take care.